So today I ask, are you ready to make your voices heard? Do we believe in freedom? Do we believe in opportunity? Do we believe in the promise of America? And are we ready to fight for it? And when we fight, we win.
When it comes to presidential elections, you often hear experts say voters don't really start paying attention until after Labor Day. Well, it's now after Labor Day, and the fight for the presidency will take on a new level of urgency. The latest polling shows Vice President Kamala Harris with a slight lead in an extremely close race. And a debate between Harris and former President Trump, set for 1 week from today, could be a major factor in the trajectory of the race. Joining us to discuss that and more, the Hill White House reporter Brett Samuels. Brett, the 2020 race came down to just 40,000 votes in a few swing states. The Harris campaign said over the weekend they expect a similar case this time. When you look at recent polling, where are we at in this race?
Yeah, well, like you said, Drew, it's looking razor close, basically, with about 2 months to go until Election Day. You have about 7 battleground states that are up for grabs that are likely to determine the outcome in November. Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Those are sort of the states that everyone will have their eyes on. Polling shows a really, really close race. Vice President Harris has sort of wiped out the lead that former President Trump had built over President Biden, especially in those Sunbelt states like North Carolina, Nevada, Arizona. There was some Emerson polling that showed Harris, essentially pulling even in those states, and really across the board, everything's pretty much within the margin of error. So, you could say that Harris is a slight favorite, which the forecast at Decision Desk HQ does. But at the end of the day, this is really anybody's race with about 2 months left until Election Day.
Now, as we enter this post-Labor Day sprint to the finish line, what are the Harris and Trump campaigns spending their time and focus on? Where are they campaigning? And what kind of events are they holding?
Yeah, so on Labor Day itself, we saw the Harris campaign sort of out in full force. The vice president was in Michigan. She was in Pennsylvania, where she joined President Biden for their first joint campaign event since there had been this swap atop the ticket. The two of them were in Pittsburgh. We saw Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, the Democratic vice presidential nominee. He was in Wisconsin. So, taken together, I think that shows that there's this big focus really from both sides, but especially from the Harris campaign on these blue wall states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Those are 3 states that Joe Biden won in 2020, that Donald Trump won in 2016. And that I think it's fair to say, whoever wins those 3 states in November has a really, really good shot of winning the presidency. So we've seen the Harris campaign there in full force. Donald Trump, he was in Pennsylvania last Saturday. He will be there for a town hall on Wednesday, and then he'll be in Wisconsin on Saturday. So those 3 blue wall states, I think, are really shaping up to be sort of the focal point of both campaigns, I think it's fair to say.
Now, speaking of Trump, during an interview on Fox News, Trump said that he had every right to interfere in the 2020 presidential election. The comments came during an interview with host Mark Levin, where Trump also marveled at how his poll numbers go up when he's indicted. Now, I think the Harris campaign probably loves when Trump is talking about 2020 and his legal troubles and not things like immigration and the economy, but I don't know, it seems like Trump may be struggling to stay on message.
Yeah, it's sort of the age-old issue for Trump and his campaign of if only, if only he could avoid these personal attacks, if only he could avoid relitigating the 2020 election and claiming fraud and claiming that it was stolen from him. If only he could just focus on immigration and the economy, which are 2 issues in particular that polls keep showing that voters trust Trump on those issues more than his Democratic opponent, then he'd be in a much stronger position heading into November. But time and time again, Trump has shown that he is either unwilling or unable to avoid wading into those personal attacks, wading into relitigating 2020. There's just something about those issues that are really, personal to him that get him really riled up. And he's basically said, he feels entitled to talk about personal attacks against Vice President Harris. We heard him over the weekend talk about how he feels, like he was entitled to to interfere in the 2020 election. So, it's clear that this is who Trump is. And I think Republicans are just going to have to kind of make peace with that and sort of hold on for these last 2 months and hope that, whatever the personal attacks are, whatever he gets off track talking about, that they can minimize the damage and hopefully pivot the conversation back to the issues that they want to talk about.
The union vote could go a long way in determining the presidential race, especially in those Midwestern swing states you talked about, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Over the weekend, Sean O'Brien, the president of the Teamsters Union, which is one of the country's largest unions, said some rank and file members were angry O'Brien wasn't invited to speak at the Democratic National Convention last month. O'Brien did speak at the Republicans' convention, using the speech to torch corporate elites who he says put profit over workers. Brett, unions have long been a key part of the Democratic coalition, but the Trump campaign says it will be a pro-labor administration.
Yeah, Sean O'Brien speaking at the Republican convention in July was sort of a surprising keynote. He was given the last speaking slot on that first night of the convention, and it was seen as this very intentional outreach by the Trump campaign to appeal to union voters, to working class voters, to say that they had a union leader on stage, somebody who might traditionally go for Democrats, was seen as sort of this big swing by Republicans. And as you said, this is an effort by the Trump campaign to try and peel away some of these union voters who are really core parts of the Democratic coalition. President Biden has long touted himself as the most pro-union president in history. Vice President Harris has tried to echo some of that rhetoric to signal that she will also be a strong advocate for union workers and for organized labor. And for the Trump campaign, obviously they've come under attack because he has gone after UAW head Sean Fain, for example. Democrats have argued that the Trump campaign, Trump talking with Elon Musk about firing striking workers, that Democrats have used those comments to basically undercut his argument that he would be a pro-labor administration. But at the end of the day, if the Trump campaign can just peel away sort of a small percentage of those union voters, that could make a difference in a really close race in some of these swing states.
A Republican group opposed to former President Trump has announced plans to spend more than $10 million on ads trying to convince people in swing states to vote for Kamala Harris. The group, called Republican Voters Against Trump, features disaffected former Trump voters in the video and on billboards. Brett, the Harris campaign itself has also been courting Republican voters. Are there any indications that this is actually working, and could these voters make a difference in the fall?
Yeah, like you said, this has been really a concerted effort. We saw obviously this ad campaign from this anti-Trump Republican group, which has been sort of focused on those battleground states, as well as Nebraska's second congressional district, which awards its own electoral vote and could play a pretty key role actually if it's a close election. But on top of that, like you mentioned, the Harris campaign has been very intentional about this. They featured some anti-Trump Republican speakers, the Democratic convention, Adam Kinzinger, Stephanie Grisham, who was a former press secretary for Donald Trump, Olivia Troy, who worked in the Trump-Pence administration, Jeff Duncan, former lieutenant governor of Georgia, was on stage speaking. So the Harris campaign has really made this very forceful effort to sort of appeal to Republicans who are tired of Trump, who are critical of Trump, to say, that there's a place in the Harris campaign for them to back the vice president, to vote for her in November. The question is, how many of those voters were, truly Republicans who were considering voting for Trump and who can be swayed, versus how many of them are sort of moderate voters who maybe already were going to vote Democrat, or maybe they were going to sit out the election in November. So, again, if this is a really close election, any sort of percentage of voters that can be swayed one way or another could really make a big difference. But clearly, this is something the Harris campaign feels like is worth doing, because they have really sunk a lot of time and effort into courting these voters.
We're also closely following the battle for control of the Senate. It's expected to come down to races in just a few states, including Montana, Ohio, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania. The experts say Republicans are favored to take the Senate. What are you watching for as we get into the final stretch for these races?
Yeah, certainly all those states you just mentioned, it's notable that, these are states where Democrats are, they hold those seats currently and they're playing defense. They're defending vulnerable seats. So really, there's a lot of pressure on Democrats. They can afford basically no losses in any of those states, because you assume they'll lose the seat in West Virginia, where Joe Manchin is retiring. So they can't afford any other losses elsewhere. And certainly those states are all going to be really really competitive races. I think one thing that's worth watching, especially now with President Biden off the ticket, is how those Democratic candidates run compared to the top of the ticket. Does Vice President Harris provide a boost for them? How do they run compared to Vice President Harris if they're able to outrun Republicans in that state? And then on the flip side, with former President Trump, does he help or hurt some of those candidates? Obviously, in a red state like Montana, it being a presidential year probably helps Tim Sheehy, the Republican there, that former President Trump is on the ballot. But maybe Trump being on the ballot hurts a Republican candidate in Michigan or Pennsylvania or Ohio potentially. So certainly it'll be interesting to see kind of the trend lines of how those Senate candidates compare to the top of the ticket in November.
Lawmakers are back in Washington today, and they are trying to find a solution to avoid a government shutdown. Brett, neither side seems to want a spending fight in the middle of an election, and they may both believe they'll have more leverage in negotiations after the election is over. Do you think a deal gets done? And if so, what does it look like?
Yeah, I think ultimately, like you said, Drew, this idea that it's an election year, that everyone has bigger fish to fry, and that they feel like, maybe come January, their party will either be in the majority or have a larger majority to work with, is a reason to think that a deal will get done here, because everyone just kind of wants to have this cleared off the deck and be able to focus on November and the elections that are going on, both at the presidential level and the congressional level. So, I think a deal does get done, but obviously there are some roadblocks, both in terms of, what would a continuing resolution look like? How long would it go for? Would conservatives and House Freedom Caucus members who are really opposed to these short-term spending deals, would they oppose and dig their heels in on something like this? And on top of that, there's this idea that Republicans are pushing this sort of legislation to ban non-citizens from voting. Of course, that's already illegal, and it happens extremely rarely, but this has been a real messaging push from Republicans to pass this legislation to show that they want to crack down on any sort of whiff of voter fraud or shady business in the election. So whether they force that to be tied to some kind of spending bill, whether they're willing to drop that as part of a deal, that is also, I think, something to watch as far as how quickly this gets done, whether it gets done, and whether there are any real hangups moving forward.
President Biden says Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is not doing enough to secure the release of hostages being held in Gaza. The comments come amid protests in Israel that erupted after the bodies of 6 hostages, including one American, were recovered from Gaza over the weekend. The Israeli military says the hostages were killed by Hamas as soldiers closed in on the tunnel where they were being held. Today at the White House, Biden and Vice President Harris received an update from advisors involved in the ceasefire and hostage deal negotiations. What are we learning coming out of that meeting?
Yeah, so the expectation is that there will be some kind of proposal for a ceasefire that gets put forward sometime this week. President Biden had hinted that that would be the case, that he and his team were working on finalizing some sort of final proposal. Essentially, we've seen this multiple times through the last few months, where White House officials have talked about there being some kind of ceasefire deal agreed to, by one party or another, and then that they're optimistic that it will get done, and then ultimately it falls through or something happens that it doesn't get done. So once again, the deaths of these hostages, I think, is spurring yet another round of cautious optimism that maybe this is sort of the sort of event that will really put enough pressure on all parties to get something done here, to get folks together at the table. But I would expect we'll hear from President Biden or some of his advisors this week about what that proposal might look like.
All right, that's all I got. Brett Samuels, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
As of Sunday, all quantities of illicit drugs are now illegal in Oregon. That's after the state's 2020 decriminalization law expired over the holiday weekend. The law, which 58% of voters approved in November of 2020, made possession of small amounts of drugs a ticketable offense with a maximum fine of $100. Possession will now be a misdemeanor in the state, punishable by up to 6 months in prison. U.S. Central Command announcing this week that it has captured an ISIS leader who helped several members of the terrorist group escape from a detention facility. CENTCOM said in a release Sunday that the U.S. and Syrian forces captured Khalid Ahmed al-Danal. Just days before his capture, al-Danal helped 5 ISIS fighters escape from a detention facility in Syria. Just 2 of those escapees have been recaptured. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.